So I define myself as, actually that's a good question. It kind of, is something that's always kind of changing. At the moment, I define myself as a PhD student. I just finished my first year in a PhD program in anthropology at New York University. And at the same time, I also would define myself as a curator and a writer, interested in a number of things, mainly I guess I'm interested in a few related things. One being the relationship between Indigenous communities and institutions, such as this museum, the Museum of Anthropology, but also historical collections of Indigenous material culture, particularly from my own community, but also here on what is called the Northwest Coast more generally. And those two interests obviously overlap and intersect. I'm also interested in the work of contemporary Indigenous artists as well. And again, I think these things overlap. So how I got to here in terms of how I developed these interests and how I've become involved in the work that I do. Let me think where to begin that story. I guess I would begin by talking about who I am in a more personal way. I'm from the Musqueam First Nation on my mom's side of the family. I grew up off reserve, meaning I grew up in some ways outside of my community, but still connected in different ways. And that itself, that history is kind of long and complicated, but is very much connected to the legislation of Canada's Indian Act, which is, its ongoing policy in terms of who is recognized as an Indian under the eyes of Canadian law, which has resulted in, has impacted families differently. And so, I guess in a lot of ways my interest in museums and museum work very much connects to an interest in my own family history and who I am and my connection to my community. Musqueam territory encompasses what is now the greater Vancouver area. So our community has been here for thousands of years, and the city of Vancouver is, it's a very recent history in comparison to our connection to this place. And so when I became a student here at the University of British Columbia as an undergraduate student, I think that's where my interest kind of really started to take shape in terms of being involved in museums. I'm sure you've met Sue Rowley, who's a curator here. Essentially, one day she had offered me a summer job through her, her relationship with my community, and I didn't really know what I was signing up for, but I needed a summer job. And basically, I showed up for the first day of work, and she said, that I was going to be helping develop the permanent display related to Coast Salish peoples in the Multiversity Gallery here. And so that summer was kind of like my first in-depth exposure to curatorial practice, to the collections here, and in many ways to community engagement. And so for me it was a very meaningful and rewarding experience because I was learning about our culture in a more general way through the collections, through the histories of those collections, but then also being able to spend time in and with community doing that work. And so that really sparked an interest for me, and then also starting to get a sense of the politics around museums and their histories and the legacies of colonial history, particularly here in this region. And also, while I was doing my undergraduate degree, I ended up majoring in First Nation Studies, which is now First Nations and Indigenous Studies here, which at the time was a young program. It's grown a lot in the past 10 years compared to when I was an undergraduate student. But, you know, one of the priorities of that program was to do research that was in collaboration with community and meaningful for community, and not just, you know, like based on the researcher's individual interests. And so it was really kind of about the ethics of research and, you know, for whom was research being done and who benefited from that research. So that I found that, you know, working in this museum context, that was kind of a good scenario to kind of pursue that type of research ethics in a way. And yeah, so from there it's kind of been like you know, it's kind of that's kind of like where this journey began in a way for me, because from there I started to become more interested in like museum studies as a discipline, Northwest Coast art history, Indigenous art history, I should say, and kind of led to further opportunities both here and in other institutions. And yes, that's kind of how there's been numerous projects that I've worked on since then that have kind of really sort of developed my understanding of community engagement, museums, and all these sort of like contemporary discussions that are happening around museums in terms of, say, like decolonization, for example.
How would you define decolonization? Not so much how would you define it, how would you like to practice that decolonization? What would be an ideal situation or context for you to decolonize a museum?
Yeah, so I mean, you were mentioning that like these conversations have often revolved around an artifact, for example, or an object. And so I was thinking about, well, actually I was reading a conversation that Karen and I had with a community member, and Karen had mentioned that she often refers to the Great Hall of this museum as an artifact in and of itself. And I was just thinking about that this morning, that could be extended to the museum itself, like, you know, this museum, you know, as a product of a particular time that had its own specific discourses around Indigenous art and how Indigenous peoples were represented, but then also museums in general as like a product of a certain way of knowing the world, and you know, what has really been defined as, or has been informed by certain perspectives or a dominant perspective around the collecting and display and quest for knowledge, to know, and also in a way that's very for me really, you know, when I think of the museum as is very much like a container, and that could be, I suppose that could be read both positively and negatively, in terms of how objects and information and culture in a way is very much contained here, and in some ways more often than not isolated from political concerns, wherein indigenous culture is contained here, and is made accessible and in some ways consumable, but then also is disconnected from issues of land and politics and the colonial present, basically. And so I guess in terms of what informs my practice, or the questions that I'm interested in, is how malleable is this museum, or museums in general, as a particular type of object or artifact, in terms of how can it be modified, or how can it be made to address the concerns of indigenous peoples today. And so for me, in a lot of ways I don't even really actually subscribe to the idea of decolonizing museums, because it's such a thoroughly colonial category or idea that to decolonize it would not be a museum, so that's, for me, that's kind of, I think, my starting point. For me, decolonization, I subscribe more to the notion that it's the return of land, basically. And I subscribe to the idea that decolonization is not a metaphor, which is has been expressed very articulately by Eve Tuck and Kay Wang Yang, who co-wrote an article of the same name, Decolonization is Not a Metaphor. And so, and the premise is exactly that it can't really be, it's not a term that can be sort of loosely applied, because it really is about the restoration of lands and resources that have been taken from indigenous peoples. And so when you think about decolonization in that way, in a way that is not metaphorical, then it becomes increasingly harder to apply that to institutions. And I think that's, in some ways, that's probably why I'm drawn to working in this context, because it's so complicated. Because, what does it mean for an institution like this one to be situated on our unceded territory, on my nation's land, basically? What are its roles and responsibilities in this context? And what does a decolonizing approach look like in an institution, whether it's a museum or a university or an arts institution? So I'm kind of, for me, when I think of museums decolonizing, I think it really has to start with their location, and their position in regards to land and territory. And I think this museum has kind of been at the forefront in that type of practice in terms of its long-standing relationship with my community. And I wouldn't be here if it weren't for that relationship. If there weren't community members before me who have been engaging with this institution, both the museum and this university. Yeah, so along those lines, like thinking about decolonizing museums, like to first acknowledge that it's not, that it can't be a metaphor, but then, so where does that leave us in terms of how museums might change their practices? I think the other main question is around, around the notion of property and how these collections came to be seen as the property or understood as the property of institutions such as this one. And so in a lot of ways, I think decolonization begins with an examination of that history and what that means, and notions of property and ownership as well. But again, it's they're very complicated questions to consider. I think that, and that's why I'm interested in them.
And how is it in your PhD program at the New York University? Are you investigating these type of questions? Are you articulating that in written text, or?
Yeah, I hope to. Like, I'm just kind of at the beginning of that program in a way, and I'm still trying to formulate what my project will be, but I think it will be trying to incorporate all those different interests in terms of, again, beginning with, for me, it's kind of like beginning with the overarching question of the dynamics or the politics of the relationships between Indigenous communities and institutions, particularly in the realm of arts, like whether it's museums, art galleries, but also archives and libraries and that kind of thing, because they all kind of share a certain history, I think, in terms of collecting and representation of Indigenous cultures and history. And have similar questions around authority and expertise and ownership. Trying to figure out how to articulate this, but I guess, like it all kind of revolves around an interrogation of contemporary practices within these institutions, and particularly in our current political climate that is really kind of, at least in the Canadian context, there's a lot of discussion around reconciliation and decolonization and what does that mean, etc. And so I'm kind of curious how those, these broader questions are playing out within this specific realm. And again, it's like, for me, my priorities are my overall priority is to work with my community and for the work that I do to be meaningful to my community. And so for me, it's kind of questioning how these institutions and how, museums, for example, can be of use and benefit for Musqueam. And then, secondary to that is like more general, connected to Indigenous communities in general. But for me, my priority is my own community and how I can use my education and experiences to help serve my community.
How did you work or intervene, collaborate with Karen Lefek and another curator on the In a Different Light exhibition?
Yeah, so that kind of I actually worked on a project prior to that called Cessnom, the City Before the City, which was a 3-part exhibit, or like 3 sites, 3 different locations here at MOA, the Museum of Vancouver, and at the Musqueam Cultural Center. And that was primarily dealing with an ancient Musqueam village and cemetery within Vancouver called Cessnom, which has its own colonial history in terms of how it was excavated and how it was interpreted and how it was represented to the public, starting in the late 1800s, basically a large-scale removal of ancestors and their belongings from the ground and being dispersed to different museum collections around the world, including the American Museum of Natural History in New York, and the Museum of Vancouver's predecessor, which was called the Centennial Museum at the time. And so basically, despite the fact that there was this mass removal of materials from that place, it wasn't recognized as being connected to Musqueam. It was kind of through the interpretation of the archaeologists and others at that time, it was disconnected from our community, and we were actually seen as our community was positioned as displacers of the previous inhabitants who had lived there. But in our history, we'd always known it as a place of our ancestors. And so to make a long story short, we developed this major exhibition that was re-examining that history, but also using that particular place and history as a lens to broader issues and in terms of how we know our history and our connection to territory more generally, because that's one of many places of our ancestors within what is now Vancouver, and that's a history that's pretty much erased within this city. So that was that project was like a major collaboration between these two institutions and my community, and so I was one of the co-curators of this exhibition, particularly the iteration that was here at MOA alongside Sue Rowley. And so for me that was like a major formative experience in terms of working closely and in collaboration with the community to have a platform for telling our own story in our own way, and how the community really directed and guided that process. And it was just like a very, I could talk for an hour just about that project in terms of how powerful it was and how important it was, and how the Vancouver community really took a strong interest, and it was a very well-received series of exhibitions that really kind of spurred discussion around these issues of place and territory and history, and also how those these sites that are archaeological sites are managed, or I think not very well managed by the province of British Columbia. So we were addressing a lot of interrelated issues through that project, but for me it was really kind of about prioritizing Musqueam voice and perspective within the institution, and that was the priority that was expressed by the community, is that this is our own history and we are the best suited to tell this history, not anthropologists, not archaeologists, not historians. It's like we are the experts in our own history and our own culture. And so it was really about the community deciding what was appropriate and important to share in this context. And so that is what kind of led to me working on the project with Karen and Bill on historical Northwest Coast art, because I think I'm trying to think of how to. I think Karen recognized my interest in these issues, around museum practices and issues of display and the colonial histories associated with these types of collections, but also I guess different strategies to exhibition making that incorporates indigenous voice and perspective. So that though, like those, I guess some of those approaches that we developed for the Musqueam exhibition in some ways carried over in a different light.
Yeah, so it's really your nation's perspective, not the scientist's perspective, but it's really them sort of giving the programming of it, or what is important to share. That's what you said, right?
Mm-hmm.
So how does this work within your community? Are you going to elders, or is this more like an agreement on what should be shared, or what are the discussions around that?
Yeah, I mean, so that, I think that's what made that exhibition, for me, what made that exhibition a success was in terms of how the community was really kind of driving the project in different ways. For like one example is that we had convened an elders advisory group that was comprised of 6 community leaders who we as a curatorial team went to for guidance and advice. And the curatorial team itself was comprised of Musqueam community members and museum curators. So we had Musqueam perspectives in the curatorial team, but then also the project as a whole, like from its initial stages in the grant writing process through to programming and education and marketing, like all of those decisions involved Musqueam perspectives and approval. So, in some ways, like when in like say other exhibition development processes, like community consultation would just be like a checkbox that happens at a stage, in that. But for us and for our community, based on the many years of engagement with this institution and others, the community's approach has been to be meaningfully engaged in all aspects related to the exhibition development. So it's kind of like an underlying to the whole timeline of the exhibition development, basically. And I think that can, in some ways, be challenging, right? Because you have people who are professionalized in their, areas of expertise, whether it's, like design or marketing or whatever, who I don't think are as accustomed to giving up some of their control or power around decision making in those realms. And so, again, it's like to recognize that this is our own story to tell and that we want to tell it in our own way means that we will have meaningful input in all areas of that. And so I think that in many ways challenges the authority of the institution as a whole, but also in terms of the people who comprise that institution. And that was the other thing too about working on that exhibition. It's not that there is one Musqueam perspective, it's not like a homogeneous thing. It's that what we tried to convey, and I hope that we conveyed in those exhibitions, is the the multitude of perspectives that make up a community and that there is no singular Musqueam voice. We really want to have this sort of like polyvocal approach in the exhibitions to, point to the fact that, different families and different individuals within the community have their own experiences and their own knowledge that has been passed down, within families, or that different families have their own ways of knowing and doing things. And so it was really trying to underline that, like any community, there's differences of opinion and different approaches. So we really tried to get a cross section of the community in that way.
Thank you. And is there anything else you would like to talk about in relation to that, or?
Not that I can think of at the moment. No, not that I can think of right now.
I don't have necessarily other questions at this point, but well, I think it's very clear. I mean, what you said also, so that's very helpful, I suppose. And so that
I was gonna say, like, I think, like the other term that I tend to use is like thinking about the notion of accountability and how institutions are accountable to their histories, but all again accountable to their, like thinking about land and thinking about where an institution is located and how they're accountable to the nations on whose land they're located on. I was just going to say something else about that, now I forgot. Oh yeah, and then also in terms of like how, communities such as my own are holding these institutions accountable. And I think that's one thing that I try to stress is that, this institution is often celebrated for its relationships with communities, indigenous communities. And I mentioned that off the top that, this is an institution that I think has been doing that better than other institutions. And when I've spent time elsewhere in the world, in New York, for example, it really kind of gives me that additional perspective to see how, in some ways, how far along this institution is compared to others. But then I am also reluctant to celebrate that to a certain extent because it's still fundamentally a colonial institution, and besides that is that the institutions such as this one have really been challenged over the past 40 years in terms of their practices and in terms of how they engage or don't engage with communities, and that communities such as my own have been part of that. They've been challenging this institution to basically do better, to respond better, to listen better. And so in some ways to celebrate the museum for being progressive or for doing a decent job of engaging with community and adapting its practices is really the result of community members and indigenous peoples saying, hey, maybe you shouldn't be putting this on display, or maybe you should be incorporating contemporary perspectives, or maybe you shouldn't own that or have that in your collection, et cetera, et cetera. And so I guess what I'm trying to get at is that we have to be careful about celebrating institutions for decolonizing, because that can kind of overlook the contributions of Indigenous communities in shifting museum and institutional practice. Yes, that's kind of one thing that I wanted to add.
Yeah, so acknowledgement and enabling, maybe, yeah. That's what I'm thinking about it. Because it has been, with some of the conversation I was in Chile was this weekend with Laura Willela, and yeah, some of this conversation that I had with her was really around enabling the nation to actually get their message out there. And with Nicola, we were talking more about the fact that if we really want to decolonize a museum, then it's not a museum, as you said, so it's something else, maybe a forum, maybe something else. So, yeah, it's interesting to have your point of view of that, yeah.
Yeah, it's like, I don't know, these are kind of like, this is stuff that I think about a lot, so it's kind of hard to like encapsulate in
Yeah,
like
sure.
a few things, but again, I think that's, you know, I mentioned that's kind of why I'm drawn to it, because there is like, in some ways it seems like there is an easy answer, like, well, museums should give everything back, and, you know, then we can move on from there, I guess, you know. But again, it's still kind of like, in some ways, rests upon the assumption that the museum as a, you know, as a thing, as a category, or as an approach, I guess to me it doesn't really, in some ways, or in a lot of ways, I have difficulty thinking about how that maps onto like Indigenous ways of knowing and Indigenous ways of educating. And I think that is something that we also kind of gestured towards in the Cessnom exhibition, is different ways, like, I guess, like Indigenous modes of pedagogy. But I mean, it's just, you know, like, it, again, that's why decolonization not being a metaphor is so important, because, you know, like you hear it applied to like decolonizing art. Well, again, like art is similarly like a very, you know, a category that doesn't really neatly map onto Indigenous traditions or Indigenous understandings. And so, yeah, it's kind of like this paradoxical or, you know, contradictory thing to say, like, decolonizing art or decolonizing museums.
When you say other forms of teaching or knowledge gathering, what do you refer to, or do you have some examples?
Yeah, so I mean, so one of the things, like one of the components of the Cessnom exhibitions that I was most satisfied with was we had like a surround sound installation of the Elders Advisory Group in conversation. And that kind of came about in a few ways, but like one of the main things is that when we were interviewing different community members for the exhibition, like doing video interviews like this basically, a lot of community members were talking about how they learned by listening and by doing, but a lot of it was like, you know, talking about their experiences of listening to their grandparents and great aunts and uncles, and just really highlighting that practice of just like sitting and listening. And that's how they came to know Musqueam history, and Musqueam teachings. And that was kind of what was happening when we were developing the exhibition as curators, like particularly those of us who are community members who are working on the project, like we would go and ask a question of the elders advisory group about, different things that we were developing for the exhibition, and it would just result in like hours of them sharing stories amongst each other, and we would just have to sit and listen and kind of learn from those narratives basically, and listening to them talk about their lived experiences and what they had heard from their elders when they were growing up, and how they basically like applied those teachings to their own lives. And so for us it was kind of like we would have to listen to those conversations and then kind of reflect on what was shared with us and how that might be applied, how the teachings or the values that they were expressing would be applied in the exhibition context. And so really it was kind of like then we decided to do this audio installation of them doing just that, just kind of like informally conversing with one another and sharing stories. It was really kind of about like listening to those stories as a set of stories, and how my position as a listener, for example, how I might relate that to my own life or situation that I'm in, and how that might change. I might think about the same story, years from now, and it would have an entirely different meaning to me. So that's one, one example for that's very much, that's very different than, like a museum's, approach is very didactic and very like, here's this label that says, this is what you need to know, or that's very authoritative and definitive in a way that is not, I guess what I'm trying to get at is like the relational aspect, or the relational aspect in terms of learning. So that's, I think, one sort of like general or fundamental difference that we were trying to point to. And then there's, I think, there's like in the realm of like education, for example, like there's a lot of there's like a growing interest in land-based pedagogy, like thinking about, there's like this program called the Dechinta Bush University that's up in the Northwest Territories amongst the Dene. There's a professor here on campus named Glenn Coulthard who's from the Yellowknives Dene and helps run that. And it's basically like very, it's just that, like in terms of land-based practices and how, the knowledge of that and the education in that. And so, and like, scholars like him and Leanne Simpson and others who have written about that, I think that's something that's kind of coming up more. And so that program is offered in conjunction with this university, so university students can go and get credit to take that course, but it's really kind of like centering indigenous knowledge and practices on the land, and so I think that's another, different, like distinct from Western forms of education or like institutional learning. Where were you asked me? I can't even remember what your question was now. Different
My
modes
question
of
was about
learning.
different modes and methods, maybe of teaching and acquiring knowledge through, and your answer was more listening to the elders and try to figure out your own way out?
Yeah, I guess it's like, you know, from my experience, it's just like, again, like less of a sort of like didactic thing, and that's kind of what we were experiencing as curators, like working with Musqueam elders. Like they weren't going to be like, you need to do this, or like we wouldn't like, they wouldn't answer yes or no to a question. It was often like we would ask a question and they would, you know, share different stories, and kind of like, again, like the conversation would kind of circle around the room where they would kind of build off one another, and so we'd have to kind of listen and reflect on how that might be applied in our specific situation.
And would there be, like, if the museum sort of is an old model, is there a gathering place or just a site where these conversations could happen? I'm not talking about collecting so much, but like, what is a museum today? Maybe what would be an utopian museum?
Yeah.
Or, you know.
See, I don't know what a utopian museum would be like. You know, I said, you know, like I said that, like, oh, the, you know, say like decolonizing museums, and like the easy answer is like, oh, they give everything back, or blah blah blah, or like, you know, maybe indigenous nations each have their own like cultural center or museum or repository or whatever. I think like utopian, I don't know, so like I guess because, you know, like due to the like the legacies of anthropological collecting and whatnot, like we don't actually know where a lot of things come from, or like the provenience or the documentation is so limited. So like there's the first, you know, like one of the big complications to like giving everything back is that there's a lot of work yet to be done in terms of, can we determine where these come from and who are the proper owners or the inheritors of certain things. But also, like, I guess why I meant, you know, like I was saying, like, how can museums be adapted to community concerns? Because I think they might, you know, they can lend themselves to shifting the perspectives of non-Indigenous people, of settler Canadians, in terms of these histories and these contemporary issues that have yet to be resolved. And so I think in today's climate, maybe they do have a role and can play a role, and I think that's what why I found the Cessnom exhibition so meaningful, is that it was really trying to, you know, it was like providing the platform for our perspectives, and hopefully change the way people who live in the city understand, you know, where they live and where they work, and how they are, you know, like in some way, you know, like are occupiers of this land. Yeah, so I don't like utopian museum. I'm not sure exactly. Like, maybe it is part of that in terms of a place where perspectives can be shared, or where there is like cross-cultural dialogue. You know, a place of learning, to be sure. But again, it's kind of like on whose terms, and who, you know, like what are the power dynamics there? And I think that's what where there's a lot of work yet to be done within arts institutions, is that they are predominantly administrated by non-Indigenous people, primarily white people, and so I think, you know, one of the main changes that can occur is who, I guess, like who's making the decisions, who, like who has the authority, and so that is kind of like one of the things that I try to advocate for, is that there are more that Indigenous perspectives are more fully integrated in the staffing and management leadership of institutions, and hopefully increasing the capacity of community members to fill those roles. So yeah, I mean, yeah, there's a lot of work to be done.